Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a 50,000-year-old cold case that's going to totally challenge how we look at human history, evolution, and honestly, even modern parenting. It's this absolutely fascinating medical mystery, and we are going to solve it step by step.
Picture this. You're unearthing an incredibly rare fossil of an ancient human ancestor. You brush away the dirt, and you realize the skull is visibly lopsided. It literally looks like this ancient being just slept on the wrong side of the bed for a really long time. For years, scientists just dismissed this as a fluke, but it turns out this tiny abnormality, it's actually a massive clue about the survival of our entire species.
Here is our roadmap for the investigation today. First, the Hobbit smoosh skull, followed by a modern baby problem. Then we'll dive into testing the fossil record, look at the evolutionary trade-off, and finally we'll see why it takes a village.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the Hobbit smushed skull.
So let's travel back to the scene of the discovery. About 50,000 years ago, a really diminutive human relative, standing only about 1 meter tall, lived on the Indonesian island of Flores. This species is known as Homo floresiensis. Fast forward to 2003, and the skeletal remains of one of these individuals, who is affectionately nicknamed Flo or the Hobbit, are discovered. 4 years later, in 2007, an anthropologist from the University of Tokyo named Yosuke Kaifu travels to Indonesia to examine Flo for himself. And he notices something that honestly, other researchers had completely glossed over.
The right side of the skull is noticeably smushed. Now, before Kaifu's visit, other researchers had attributed this weird asymmetry to some random disease, or they just assumed the skull had been squashed by heavy dirt and pressure after she was buried. But Kaifu wasn't convinced. He had a hunch that this wasn't post-mortem damage. He actually believed this happened while Flo was still alive.
Which brings us to Section 2, a modern baby problem.
To solve this 50,000-year-old mystery, Kaifu took images of the skull to a modern clinician in Japan, and he got a pretty shocking diagnosis: deformational plagiocephaly. In everyday language, that's flathead syndrome. It's a completely harmless flattening of the skull caused by repeated pressure on one side during the very first months of a baby's life. Now, usually, the skull rounds out over time as the child grows, but in some cases, like our ancient friend Flo, it can persist all the way into adulthood.
And this is exactly where the ancient past collides with our present. Get this, 1 in 6. That is how many modern babies develop this exact same condition today. 1 in 6. So we're not talking about some rare, extinct disease here. This is happening in nurseries and living rooms right now.
So why does this happen? Well, first, human babies are born with really soft skulls. And that's absolutely crucial to allow for the massive, rapid brain growth that happens in those months just after birth. Second, human babies are incredibly helpless. They literally cannot hold up their own heads. And third, because of that extreme helplessness, when they're put down to rest, their heavy heads just naturally flop to one side. Sustained pressure on that soft bone creates the flat spot. So Kaifu realized something groundbreaking. If this ancient hominin had flathead syndrome, it meant ancient babies were just as helpless as modern ones.
All right, let's look at Section 3, testing the fossil record.
A theory is kind of nothing without proof, right? Kaifu and his team needed hard data to back this up. This led to a fascinating comparative study published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. They examined the skulls of 508 Homo sapiens, so that's both modern people and ancient burials going back up to 1,000 years. Skull flattening, highly prevalent. Then, they looked at an enormous sample size of 996 great apes, chimps, gorillas, bonobos, orangutans. Among apes, flattening was exceedingly rare. Finally, they looked at 5 adult skulls of Homo erectus, which is a very distant human ancestor. And the result? 2 out of the 5 showed this exact same skull flattening.
Drilling down into those Homo erectus skulls, these fossils were found in Indonesia and date back a staggering 100,000 to 300,000 years ago. These ancestors had brains about 2/3 the size of ours. But most importantly, the researchers rigorously tested the skulls and completely ruled out any distortions from burial or the fossilization process. The flattening was genuine. The crucial takeaway here is this: the helplessness that causes flathead syndrome isn't just a modern human trait. It stretches back hundreds of thousands of years across multiple branches of the human family tree.
Moving into Section 4, the evolutionary trade-off.
So, why did nature design us to be born so completely helpless when other animals just aren't? Well, the answer becomes pretty obvious when we compare human babies to great ape babies. Great ape babies are born relatively developed. They're highly mobile. I mean, they can cling to their mothers almost immediately. And because their skulls harden faster without the need for explosive post-birth brain growth, they have a super low rate of skull flattening. Human babies are the exact opposite. We've got underdeveloped brains at birth, extreme helplessness, and those super soft skulls.
It all comes down to a brilliant biological compromise. Step 1. Human evolution, specifically the fact that we walk upright on 2 legs, limits the size of the birth canal. Step 2. At the exact same time, human brain sizes are drastically increasing in our evolutionary history. So how do you fit a giant brain through a narrow canal? Step 3. Babies have to be born early, while the brain is still relatively underdeveloped and the skull is soft enough to essentially squeeze through, which leads directly to Step 4. Extreme infant helplessness. That smushed skull from 50,000 years ago is literal, physical proof of the exact moment in evolution where our ancestors traded physical independence at birth for the giant brains that eventually allowed us to conquer the globe.
Finally, Section 5. It takes a village.
So what does this extreme helplessness actually mean for how early humans lived day to day? Well, sustained head pressure on ancient babies reveals that they required intense, constant physical care. Pediatrician Herbert Renz-Polster noted something super fascinating about this. Today, babies get flat spots because they sleep safely on their backs in cribs or spend hours sitting in modern car seats. But hundreds of thousands of years ago, there were no car seats. Ancient babies had to be carried and constantly watched just to survive their own helplessness. The fact that these infants survived long enough to develop these flat spots and then actually grow into adults proves that ancient hominins were providing an incredible, highly attentive level of care.
Anthropologist Jeremy De Silva perfectly captures the heart of this explainer. He says, the whole, it takes a village expression is pretty deeply rooted in our evolutionary past. Because our babies were born so helpless, a mother just couldn't do it alone. It required siblings, grandparents, and the wider community to carry, protect, and care for these highly vulnerable infants. Our giant brains made us helpless, but that very helplessness forced us to cooperate, to bond, and to build the very first human communities.
You know, we often view needing help as a weakness in our modern hyper-independent society. But this ancient evidence tells a completely different story. If profound helplessness and the need for intense communal care is exactly what built our human communities in the first place, what does that say about how we should be caring for each other today? It's a 50,000-year-old reminder that we were never meant to do this alone. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible investigation, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.